All right, thank you. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to talk about state-of-the-art tools for modeling or surveying horse populations and modeling fertility control. And, you know, this is going to be kind of a tale of two talks here on survey methods and population models. Hopefully, unlike Dickens, it'll only be the best of times. So we're going to start off talking about survey methods. So, you know, this is a fertility control conference. Why are we talking about survey methods? Right? And surveying is really important both to plan any fertility control you're doing and also to evaluate if it worked. Right? So you're going to plan how many animals do you have, how many animals do you need to treat. You might need to know practical things like where can you find horses, where should I put trapping sites. Surveys can give you that information. You also want to evaluate the efficacy, right? So you do a fertility control treatment. You don't want to just find out, you know, hey, what happened to the animals I've treated? You want to find out, did this control population growth? So you need to figure out, look at growth rates, foaling rates, and you do that for the population as a whole. So you need to do surveys to figure that out. And of course, you know, if you're BLM or Park Service or Forest Service, you often have legal requirements to survey also. So if you're planning a survey, you know, that your primary goal is always going to be to estimate your population size, or NHAT. But then you should think about, in the planning stage, you know, think about what are your secondary goals? What are your other information needs? You know, do you need to know the foal ratio? Do you need to figure out horse distribution? Do you want to know about range conditions, water availability? Or are you interested in genetics? You know, figure out what other information that you need and that you're interested in other than just population size. And then, of course, you also should consider other things like what's your budget and what's your tolerance for uncertainty. You know, do you need to know that you have 500 animals and not 550? Or is it okay to know that I have somewhere between 400 and 600? You know, you need to think about what's your tolerance for uncertainty and how much money do you have and how much money are you willing to spend to reduce that uncertainty. Then you also need to think about, you know, what are your restrictions? You know, if you're working in an area that's really inaccessible, that doesn't have roads, or can you get in on roads? How big of a population are we talking about? Are we talking about a couple of hundred animals or a couple of thousand or 20,000? You know, the answers to those are going to drive how you're going to do a survey. Then you also should think about other resources that you can tap into. So things like, do you have volunteers that you can use? Do you have students that are looking for projects? Do you have associations with research, with universities or researchers that have, you know, specialized expertise or genetics labs? Are there other agencies, state agencies, or the federal agencies that you can work with, tap into both budgets, resources, expertise? So when you're planning the survey, you should think about all these things that you need and that you can get and what your restrictions are, and use that to then pick a method. And in general, there are really 5 verified methods that'll definitely work. You know, there's none perfect. So here in blue are things that are good. You know, low cost is good, low risk is good, high cost is bad, that's in red. Right? High risk is bad, that's in red. Well, you can see that there's no perfect method, right? There's no method that's blue all the way across. So there are always trade-offs when you're doing methods. And so we're going to go through these here. So the first thing you can do is a ground count of known individuals. And what I mean by known individuals is that you have every animal in the population named, right? You know that Molly is a 6-year-old mare who had a foal in middle of May, right? So you're doing ground surveys. It's extremely labor intensive. You almost can only do it either with a dedicated field staff or with volunteers. You need horse color. You know, you need to be able to identify every horse in the population. It's not enough if you have, 1 to 25 bays that I really can't distinguish. You need to know every single horse in there. That means that, you know, you need a pretty small population, right? It's not going to work anywhere over a few hundred animals. But if you can do it, you need an accessible area, right? You need an area you can get into on the ground with roads. If you can do it, that's the gold standard. If you can do it, you know, if you can get out there and see every horse out there, that's the best way to do it. It's extremely high accuracy. At USGS and BLM, when we test out new methods, we test out methods on areas where we can do this, where we know every individual out there, and then we see how well these new methods work. But in a lot of cases, you can't use that, right? And so you have to use other things. The sort of bread and butter for BLM The go-to method are simultaneous double observer methods, and I'll go into a little bit of the mechanics of that in a sec. But the big thing is that there are no area restrictions, no size restrictions. So you can do this over any population, over any size. The accuracy tends to be really good. There are certain situations where no, it doesn't work. So it tends to not work very well in trees, where you have a lot of tree cover. And it can be, but you can be potentially biased by horse movement. In those situations, aerial photo mark recite can be a good method. It's robust to trees and robust to horse movement. What you're doing is if you have an area, you're doing this from the air. You fly over it 6, 7, 8 times, usually at different angles. So you fly, east to west, and then north-south, and then west to east, and then south to north. And you're changing angles all the time. And you're taking photos of every group you're seeing. And then at the end of the survey, you have thousands of photos of these groups, and you figure out, okay, in each of my, let's say, 8 surveys that I did that I flew over the area, in how many of those did I see this particular group? So you're looking through photos. It's very labor intensive. You need to be able to identify groups, which means you need a lot of horse color. You need to be pretty small population size. It needs to be pretty small area. So it doesn't work everywhere, but it's effective. But it's very high cost because you're flying a lot. So it's about twice the flight time of a double observer survey. So these top 3 is basically what BLM uses. There are a couple of other ones that are really good. And the nice thing about these 2 on the bottom is that you're directly trading off costs for uncertainty. So here, mark recite distance sampling. So that's what the Navajo Nation did a couple of years ago to survey. So the Navajo Nation is 17 million acres. They have something like 30,000 horses. So it's a huge area, really inaccessible, very few roads. And what you can do on distance sampling is that you're sampling, so you're not flying the whole area. You're sampling with transects. You can trade off. You can say the more transects I fly, right, the higher my cost, but the lower uncertainty I have, right? Or I can say, I want to save costs. I'm going to fly fewer transects. That's going to drive up my uncertainty. And so you can kind of find that balance. If you're working on anything larger than 10 million acres, that's really your only option, unless you have some really clean breaks. You can kind of stop the survey. But if you're talking about huge areas, this is a go-to method. DNA mark recapture, that's how we survey grizzly bears, right? Taking genetic samples from hair samples or grizzlies. You can do that on horses. The costs are quite high, but it's effective. And again, the more you sample, the better your estimate's going to be, but the more it's going to cost, right? So you can, again, use that sort of, okay, what am I willing to spend? But just to think about it, so a DNA sample costs about $100. If you have a population of 200 horses, you want to have a chance to, do a 3-occasion sample. So you want to see each horse 3 times. So you're going to collect 600 fecal samples. That's $100 times 600. That's $60,000. All right. So it works, but it's high cost. But you do have flexibility, and you find out about genetics. So these are the 5 methods that generally work well. There are other methods that really don't work or only work in specialized circumstances or that we're just not sure of yet. So we have experimental ones, infrared transects. We know that they work sometimes. We know that they don't work sometimes. We don't know when they work and they don't work. With drones, we're testing out. We've done some military-grade drones on military bases. Again, we know that they sometimes work. We know they sometimes don't work. We don't know the conditions when they do and don't work. I'm personally pretty... you can use orthorectified aerial photography. So they do that to survey caribou populations in Alaska. You take super high-definition pictures, like 100-megapixel cameras, take photos of groups. It can work. We just haven't, I'm hopeful down the line we'll be able to do that, but, it's just not ready. Things that I really push people not to do, one are ground counts from if you don't know individuals. So you can do distance sampling from the ground along roads. The problem is roads are almost never representative, right? And what you're doing on distance sampling is that you're driving along a road to figure out a density, and I'm extrapolating to densities along roads to every other area where they're not roads. And roads are almost never representative, right? Roads by themselves can change horse distribution. So, either attract horses if there's salt or repel horses, if there's lots of traffic and noise. And oftentimes roads are drawn, where it's really nice and flat, like along creek beds, right, where there's a lot of water. That's not representative, right? And the problem you can run into, let's see if I can get this laser to work, is you can end up right here, right, where it looks like you have confidence because they keep getting the same results, but they're biased, right? That's a dangerous situation to be in. You don't want to be in that situation. So in general, anything from roads, I'm very wary of. Game cameras, same way. If you don't know individuals, and you keep getting pictures of bays, does that mean that you have, hundreds of bays, or does it mean that you have, a couple of groups that just keep walking by the camera? It's hard to know. Typically, these are not available to horses. So aerial mark resite with radio collars. Game and fish departments do that on elk. That's because you have radio collars on elk. We usually don't have radio collars on horses. You need radio collars. Ground photo mark resite works awesome on zebras. You can take a picture of a zebra and then take a picture of the same zebra 3 years later, and you can be 100% positive. Zebra stripes are like fingerprints. You can be 100% positive that that's the same zebra, even if it's 1,000 zebra in that population. But you usually can't do that on horses, right? You need a ton of color. Maybe in some small populations where, again, you can identify every individual, it's possible, but in general, it doesn't work. If you're in a huge HMA in Nevada, it's just not going to work. I'm going to just very briefly run through how you do these double observer methods. It's kind of as I said, it's kind of the bread and butter for BLM. It's probably 95% of the surveys we do. You use a fixed wing or a helicopter with a pilot and 3 trained observers. What you do is that you set up the flight lines in advance. I set up the flight lines in advance to cover 100% of the HMA. So we have here, you can see these lines. The idea is you're going to eyeball every square foot of the area where you think there might be a horse, and then you're going to use a double observer method, which is just a mark recapture, to figure out how many of those horses you missed. But what it means is that you have to cover the whole area. And then you record detection covariates for each group, so things like group size and vegetation cover, accounting for differences in observers. And then you go home and you do that, and then you do a bunch of math, or I do a bunch of math. The key is that if you're interested in doing this, BLM and USGS has spent a lot of time and a lot of money figuring out where this works and where it doesn't work. So if you're interested in doing this, please get in touch. We've tested this on known populations, so on 7 known populations shown in green, and then in the black are our estimates with 95% confidence intervals. We know it from the CM here. It's Cedar Mountain. There are a lot of trees there. And you can see that we have more uncertainty there, right? So we know that there are certain places where it doesn't work, it doesn't work as well. And we spend a lot of time doing this. So we survey about 20 million acres a year. Each year we flow about 30,000 linear miles of transects. That's enough to take you around the equator and then keep going around the Atlantic. We do this a lot. We spend $1.2 million every year making sure we do this right. So again, if you're interested in doing this, please get in touch. The future directions, we had our first plane crash a year ago. No fatalities, but a couple of serious injuries. So it's a real push to get people out of the air using these methods I touched on earlier. All right, so I'm going to change course here. Those are survey methods. And now we're going to talk about population models and population modeling. So again, this is a fertility control workshop. Why are we talking about population models? And population modeling is really, really useful as a planning tool to plan and then evaluate your different options. So you're planning a fertility control treatment. How many are you going to treat? Who should you treat? How often do you need to treat them? What treatments should you use? You can then model those and then evaluate what's going to happen to the horse population, so outcomes, and then cost, how much is going to cost you. So the background here is the current modeling tool is this tool called WinEquus. It was developed by Steve Jenkins in 1996. It's a really good population modeling tool. The problem with it is it has weaknesses. And the big weaknesses are it's really difficult to compare scenarios. So it outputs one thing at a time, which makes it difficult to say, okay, well, I can't compare. What if I try something else? It's hard. It only saves outputs, not inputs. So if somebody says, shows you, oh, this is the outcome of what I propose to do, you don't know what they put into it, right? And maybe they put in something nonsensical. It's hard to know. It's inflexible. It can do what it can do, but it's hard to do anything else. And it doesn't have a cost calculation. And so we're updating WinEquus, and as you can guess, these are the things we're trying to tackle. So what we're calling this new tool is PopEquus. So the pie in the sky goal is really to give managers a tool to evaluate outcomes and costs and to find optimized outcomes, right? Enable managers to have a powerful tool that they can use to really optimize the different management scenarios. So where the rubber hits the road on that is we need to make it accessible but powerful. So it needs to be easy to use, but at the same time customizable and flexible. We need to have a high transparency, so if somebody runs a model, somebody else can verify that indeed that makes sense and that we can repeat that. And really it's to encourage tinkering. And I'll show you what we're going to do. We're going to tinker here at the end of the talk. So it's going to run as a web application. So it's going to look like a web page. You go to a web page, you load it up, you put different parameters into it, mess around with what you want to do. But it's our code that runs models. The reason why we're using a web application it is for several reasons. The key ones are we can update things on the fly. So if we get more data, new models, some new fertility control we want to use, we can upload it, push it up to the website, and now I know everybody's using it. So it's flexible. We can update new stuff on the fly. You have interactive graphs and tables, which is good, and it's much easier to use than our code. It's going to be geared to BLM, but customizable. So if you have costs that you think are different, you can change the costs. I'm hoping it's going to be done this summer, in 2019. I'm saying ish because who knows what's going to happen. But that's our goal. What it does right now, so it's sort of an almost beta version. And we're starting off doing just a subset of stuff before we're ready to develop the full thing. We just want to make sure in the beta version that we can do a subset of models and then put it in the hands of managers so they can tell us, hey, is this actually useful to you? Does this work? What kind of things should we change? And so the things that we've implemented so far, no action, so just let the population grow. Doing removals only, PCP22, and Spaying. And things that we are planning to add are Zonastat, Gonacon, gelding, and then as new things come available, we can add those, right? So IUDs, Spayvac, we can add these things as data become available, we can add them. And then we're going to do different combinations. Right now, the only one we've done implement is removal and Spaying. These are hypothetical scenarios. Eventually we're going to add lots of combinations. We want to make sure that we have these fine-tuned and are really working well before we start combining things. So right now, that's what we've done. What the bones of it are that it's an age-structured population model. So what that means is that I have a population structure here, right here, with different, how many animals are in each of these age classes. And I'm going to project that forward with a population projection matrix, which has survival rates here, and then foaling rates in that first line, in the first row. So we have several. These are from WinEquus, which uses, I think, 4 different published vital rates and survival and foaling rates. That's what we implemented so far. As we get more data, we're going to incorporate new data. It's a stochastic projection, so we have environmental variability, so things change between years, and demographic stochasticity. We're going to track individuals. So what this model does is that it's going to project things forward and then track individual animals both on the range and in holding facilities over time. And then what we're doing with those is that we can calculate costs then on an annual basis, on a per-head basis, based on those individual animals to track costs. So, for example, if we have a population of 1,000 animals on range, we're going to do a gather. We think we can gather 80% of the population, so I'm going to gather 800 animals. We're going to do it with a helicopter, which costs $800 a head. So now my on-range cost is going to be 800 times 800, so $640,000. Now I'm going to do, let's say, PZP 22. Primer costs for that are $510. So let's say I'm going to treat 300 animals at $510 per primer. So now I have another $150,000 of on-range costs. Then out of those 800, I'm treating 300, and I'm going to take, let's say, 300 off-range. So out of those 300 that go off-range, I'm going to say 100 get adopted. Adoption costs to BLM are about $2,400 a head. So now I've taken 100 times $2,400 of my off-range costs, and I have 200 animals remaining in off-range facilities. They start off in short-term holding facilities, which cost $5 a day. Would say you can do it for 18 months. They stay there. And then they go into long-term holding facilities at $2 a day. And then we're going to track the animals over time, right? Once they're in holding facilities, they're there. They don't reproduce. They just survive until they die of old age. And we're going to track them and track costs. So that's the bones behind the model. What it actually output looks like is that we have a graph here. So it has a graph and a chart. And the graph is population projections at different management scenarios, and then a chart of costs. And so to walk through this, so we have these colors here, represent different management scenarios shown here. So this is a no action in black, just goes up, and then in blue we have removals only. So we do removal here in year 4, we do removal, and then it grows again. There's PZP 22 only, and we'll start messing around with parameters that we used in the next step here, but I just want to walk you through what it looks like. And then we have, let's say, a spay. You can think about spay as anything that's 100% effective, any fertility treatment that's 100% effective and permanent. And then a removal and spay, so I did removal and then spayed after the removal. The key here is, we have these bold lines, which are deterministic rates, so that's kind of what you can roughly expect to happen. And then stochastic runs are in these lighter colors. So in this gray here, and that's basically your uncertainty estimate. So say, okay, well, if you do, no action, you can expect about to end up here, but you could end up anywhere here. This tool is not a predicting the future tool. This is an apples-to-apples comparisons of what you can reasonably expect to happen and compare outcomes in an apples-to-apples way. What we have here in the chart then is we're tabulating costs. And so what we're doing here, so I don't know if you probably can't see the number down here. So this is projecting for 10 years. And so my on-range costs are 10 years. But then I did this removal here, right? And so these animals are in holding facilities, and animals in holding facilities live for 25, 30 years, right? So I'm going to calculate off-range costs for a further 25 years, not just these 10 years, but then an additional 25 years after that. So my total costs here are for 35 years, and what it says, which you can't read, is that these are operating costs. These are cumulative operating costs to BLM. This does not account for ecological costs of having, now going from 600 to 2,000 animals on the range. We're only tabulating operating costs. So that's basically what the model does. And then for the rest of this talk, we'll just start tinkering around with it. So we're going to take an example scenario. Let's say we have 600 horses, which includes foals. We're going to say is a BLM herd, and it has an appropriate management level, or AML, of 150 to 300 animals. We're going to do a helicopter gather, which we're going to say costs $800 a head. We're going to say we can gather 80% of the population. Anytime we do a gather, we're always going to miss 20%, and that 20% is random, so it's not the same 20% every year. It's a random 20% that we just can't capture. And then we're going to evaluate different options, so PZP 22, spaying, and removals. And the first thing we're going to start messing with is PZP 22. And the first thing is to look at, okay, well, what if we do PZP 22 starting at different age classes? So, apples to apples, first thing is that we're going to do a PZP treatment. We're going to assume it's going to happen every other year. That's what those red arrows on top are. And then what we're going to test is, what if I start with, which animals should I start treating? And so should I let young animals reproduce, contribute genetically before I start treating them? So that's going to be, in the green here is going to be the youngest I'm treating is the 6-year-olds. I'm going to treat 6-year-olds all the way up to however old they get, versus what if I start with 4-year-olds, versus what if I start with the yearlings. And what you can see here is if you start with yearlings, the population is still growing, but it grows a lot slower if I treat yearlings as opposed to, if I leave yearlings in some older age classes. The really interesting thing here is if you look at this, is that it's actually not only the best outcome, but it's the cheapest. So up here, and the reason it's the cheapest, even though I'm proportionally treating fewer animals every time, right, what's happening is there's more and more animals out there. The population is growing faster. So every gather I do, there's more animals I have to gather, which costs $800 a head, and there's more animals that I then have to treat, right? So essentially what ends up happening here is what this shows is that we should be treating starting with the yearlings here. All right, so that's the first part. So the next question is, how often should I be treating? And so we're going to try a couple of different intervals. So the first one, let's say we'll start with in blue here, is we're going to treat every 4 years. So that's a typical kind of BLM gather schedule, where you're doing a helicopter gather. It's hard to do it more often than every 4 years. And you can see that, I've reduced population growth here some, but it's still growing a lot. So what if I can do it every 2 years here? Then, the population about doubles. If I can do it every year, I basically stabilized it. So by the way, these are, what we're assuming here is that there's increasing efficacy with boosters. This is from Rutberg paper from 2017, I believe. And, as I said earlier, we're treating 100% of yearlings and older, 100% of the captured animals, right? So in this model, every year, there's 20% of the population that's untouched. We can't gather them. So, if you look at these costs, what you can see here is that, if I treat every year, it's going to cost me about $4.5 million, as opposed to if I do it every year, $2.7 million, as opposed to every 4 years, $2 million. So from that, it's probably not reasonable to be able to do a helicopter gather every year. Even every other year is a lot. But, that's quite a lot of bang for your buck for $700,000 is that, you've taken a lot of animals off there. So we're going to, then you use this red one. So we're going to treat PCP every 2 years. And now we're going to compare it against some other options. So let's start messing with those other options. What if I can do Spaying? This is all hypothetical. So Spaying is, again, we're going to start, what if we can do different age classes? Do I want to let younger animals have a chance to contribute? For an apples to apples, we're going to assume we're treating every 3 years. We'll mess around with it next. But to start with, just look at different age classes. And again, what you can see is Spaying yearlings. Every 3 years basically flattens out population growth, and it's the cheapest, just like with PCP, right? The more animals you treat, the more aggressively you treat younger animals, the cheaper it gets because you flatten out population growth, so there are fewer animals out there to have to gather and have to treat. All right, so we're going to treat yearlings. How often should I do it? Let's start with, should I do it every 4 years, every 3 years, or just in a rapid succession of years 1 and 3 and then just leave it? And again, what we can show here is that, here's a blue if I treat in years 1, and then again in year 6, or 1 year and then year 5, and then year 9, you can see little bumps here, versus years 1, 4, and 7, versus years 1 and 3. So the outcomes here, the red and the green, are pretty similar, but the costs, if I do only years 1 and 3, that costs me $400,000 less. It's in millions of dollars. So that looks like the best option to me. So, okay. So we're going to compare that to PCP. Now let's say, what if I only do removals? In this graph here, so now we're going to remove, and we're either going to remove to, high AML of 300, and then let it grow, and we're going to do that every 3 years, versus what if I remove to 200 animals every 4 years, versus what if I remove to low AML, so 150, and I do that every 5 years? What are the costs? One thing I want to point out is that I show AML here. In the previous graph, so we're going to step back for a second. This does not show AML because we never reach it, right? We start off at 2 times AML. The population here, we're Spaying, we never get it to decrease down to AML. So AML isn't on the graph because it's over it's always over doesn't even show up on the graph. So here we are, we're doing removal, and we're moving down to AML, either high AML or low AML. We can compare costs. You know, if you remove down to 300 or 200, it ends up costing about $6.5 million. If I remove down to low AML to 150, it's going to cost about 4.9. It's actually an underestimate, because what ends up happening is the way this model runs is that you don't do a gather if you don't go over AML. And we can see here in year 6, when I'm doing the second one, is that in about half the cases I'm not over AML yet, and so that population just keeps growing. And so what we're going to actually do when we're going to compare all these scenarios, instead of saying, okay, well, I'm definitely going to do a removal in year 6, I'm going to say, no, I'm going to do removal whenever I hit AML again after the initial removal. And so then I can use these, compare these optimized scenarios where I have, okay, here's what happens if I do nothing, no action. Here's what happens if I use PCP22. That's going to cost me $2.7 million versus, here I'm a spay only. That's going to cost me $900,000. Removals only is going to cost me, once I do it, stochastically, whenever I hit AML, I'm going to estimate it's going to cost $6.1 million. Versus what if I do a removal and spay? I didn't tinker with this, but there I'm just taking the best case scenarios for both of these. So I'm going to remove down to low AML and then spay in years 1 and 3. And so then, that stabilizes the population at low AML. And now I can compare, these different scenarios and compare costs and say, hey, what's it worth it to me? It essentially gives managers a tool to decide, here, if they want to do spaying, if they're willing to do spaying, they can say, okay, well, I can stabilize at low AML. It's going to cost me, about $4.8 million over 35 years. Or I can stabilize it at twice over AML, and it's only going to cost me $900,000, right? Or do I want to just keep doing removals only? That's going to cost me $6.1 million, right? It gives managers, in the USGS, we're in the business of giving information to managers and letting managers decide, and this is what this tool is really trying to do. That's all I have. So, I really want to thank USGS and BLM, particularly Paul and Alan who are here. And I'm not going to take questions until after the question period. Thanks.